vast majority of story-based video games have villains, so with so many out there, it's incredibly tough for developers to make theirs truly unique. As such, even the strongest video games tend to lean back on tried and tested tropes every now and then. But these aren't always inherently a bad thing, and even the most popular baddies have used more than one of the following. Major spoiler warnings will follow, because I'm Sai, this is WhatCulture, and these are the 10 biggest video game villain cliches, and why we love them. Is there any video game villain cliche more howlingly predictable than the primary antagonist turning out to be one of your own supposed pals? Though it can certainly elicit a potent eye roll in serious-minded games, I mean you'd hate to see it in The Last of Us for instance, it can nevertheless prove to be a ton of fun in games more keen to embrace their own sense of silliness. Case in point, Resident Evil's reveal that badass STARS captain Albert Wesker had been working with the Umbrella Corporation all along was a brilliantly shocking slice of kitsch ripped right out of a sci-fi horror B-movie. You were distracted by zombies, monsters, and the suspicious Barry Burton? Well, guess what? Barry's a pawn, and the man who wears sunglasses at night inside of a haunted house is the bad guy. In similarly ridiculous terms, Metal Gear Solid had villain Liquid Snake posing as Solid Snake's codec support character Master Miller for most of the game. In perhaps its most ingenious instance, BioShock revealed that your ally Atlas was megalomaniacal baddie Frank Fontaine the whole time. It can be an undeniably played out twist in 2020, yet when a game manages to pull it off with sufficient sneakiness or self-awareness, it's incredibly satisfying, and it can really help tie things together with a satisfying injection of "what the hell, of course, why didn't I see that coming?" Number 9, the ridiculous final form. Many video games will pit players against the antagonist more than once before it's all said and done, and it's incredibly common for the final boss fight to unfold in multiple phases. Typically, you'll fight a more recognisable, manageable version of the villain before they're transformed into a bigger, badder rendition, usually with some sort of supernatural or cybernetic upgrade. The textbook example is of course Final Fantasy VII's Sephiroth, who starts out resembling a pretty regular humanoid before becoming an angelic monstrosity in his final safer Sephiroth form. To be fair, Square Enix love this cliche in general, but it's widely prevalent across video games as a whole. Ganondorf has a habit of beefing up his form throughout the Zelda franchise, and of course who can forget Undertale's grotesque Flowey. Even away from fantasy titles, Batman Arkham Asylum is at least a little more grounded, and it still infamously saw the Joker transformed into a gigantic hulking mutation of his former self by the end. Heck, it even became a plotline for the next game, which is pretty neat. It's such a completely predictable route for final boss fights to go, and yet as long as the design work is creative enough, it can still be a ton of fun, cliches be damned. Number 8, the princess is in another castle. So I'm going to level with you here. The first time that I played Final Fantasy VII at something like 7 or 8 years old and I beat the Scorpion boss and blew up the reactor, my brain that was used to 1 hour long games on the Mega Drive thought that it was over. It wasn't even the end of disc 1, let alone the game. But more than just the fact that there were 2 more discs in the case, I really should have seen it coming, as video games had been doing this for a long time. Heck, the trope's name comes from the most famous example in the original Super Mario Bros., where Mario repeatedly learns that he's been fighting a decoy version of Bowser, and Princess Peach is actually sequestered with the real Bowser at another castle entirely. Try again, Mario. We've all been there though. A game will make you feel like you're entering the final stretch, but after doing battle with the quote final boss, it turns out there's still a little or a lot more game left to go. While it can certainly prove frustrating in bad games, if it's a game you're enjoying, it simply means you've got more game to sink your teeth into, which is rarely a bad thing. Number 7, all the life bars. Life bars are one of the most basic video game mechanics there are, offering up a visual indication of a boss's health to let the players know how well or how badly they're doing. And while the majority of games simply give enemies a single life bar, some dare to give bigger bosses, and especially the final big bad themselves, multiple life bars to convey just how tough and badass they truly are. I mean, yes, you could just make the bar represent 100% of their hit points regardless, and it would just go down slower if they have more, but no, players should see not only how far they've come to this point with how much their attacks can do, but also how much of a struggle it's going to be regardless of that against a boss with ridiculous health bars. Franchises such as Bayonetta, Dynasty Warriors, and Mass Effect also tend to give bigger bosses multiple life bars, and while it does sometimes lead to frustration, the satisfaction of slogging your way to the end speaks for itself, and this is taken to almost parody extremes in the Yakuza franchise, where late game boss encounters can have up to 6 life bars, which is 6 times the satisfaction in theory, because if nothing else it truly makes it feel like you earned your victory. Number 6, the mirror antagonist. Though an extremely common trope in video games, the mirror antagonist is popular throughout all kinds of media, movies, TV, and especially comic books with superheroes. If a game's designers can't come up with an interesting look for a villain, why not just imitate the hero and give them a sinister spin? And so countless video games have created antagonists who are basically polarity reversed iterations of the protagonist, such as Mario's frenemy Wario, who not only looks like Mario's evil twin brother, but his name also basically means bad Mario in Japanese. Heck, even Luigi gets a mirror antagonist himself, and on the other side of things, Sonic the Hedgehog's shadow is also much of the same. But to be fair, before even that there was Metal Sonic, and similarly he was joined by, albeit rarely, Mecha Knuckles and the all too creepy Tails doll. Seriously, why did they make that? In more literal examples, you have Devil May Cry's Virgil, who's Dante's older twin brother, and some of them are quite simply evil clones like the appropriately named Dark Link from the Zelda series. While it's easy to dismiss the yin and yang approach to villainy as lazy and desperate, it can also be a fun way to literalize the protagonist's own internal struggle. I mean, after all, you are facing off against a foe who so blatantly resembles your character. Number 5, the mid-boss battle banter. It's low-key ridiculous that so many final bosses will expend precious energy to verbally dress you down in the middle of battle, dropping vicious wrestling-style promos in many cases that insist you haven't got a hope in hell of beating me. This is extremely common in action-adventure games in particular, such as Ratchet and Clank, No More Heroes, Devil May Cry, etc. Metal Gear Rising Revengeance might take the crown, however, with its final boss Senator Armstrong, the patron saint of trash talk, who basically doesn't stop giving you savage quips while you try to mount an offense against him. It can certainly be annoying in a tough boss fight, or if the boss just recycles the same 4 catchphrases for the entirety of the battle, but when it's done well, it can add a layer of pulpy, comic booky absurdity to proceedings. You'd notice if it wasn't there. Number 4, the vulgar display of power. Now, the writer of the original article here, knowingly or otherwise, has made a reference to Pantera's seminal 1992 album of the same name, which is appropriate as this entry is all about scumbags. If you know, you know. It goes without saying that villains have to do something to make them actually villainous, and across media this will typically be a show of force. A display of power excessive enough to ensure that the audience/player are fully on board with them going down. What this is can vary depending on the tone of the game itself, but in more realistic settings it often takes the form of some very real views and mindsets put into action that will make your stomach turn. Given that video games are a more active art form, it's especially important that the player has no lingering doubts about how the villain must be stopped, and so it's incredibly common for game antagonists to do something totally unconscionable in order to draw clear battle lines. Examples include Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, which made players hate primary antagonist's second sister from the jump, by having her brutally and pointlessly murder Cal's friend Prath in the game's opening sequence. That's evil with a capital E. In the opening of Wolfenstein 2 The New Colossus, we see Frau Engel ruthlessly bully her own daughter for her weight and for being queer, before executing the protagonist's ally and mocking them with their detached head. Grim. These moments can be upsetting and nauseating, and they're essentially an effortless way for developers to push your buttons and manipulate you. But when they work, they create soul-piercing, even controversial gaming moments you won't ever forget. Number 3, the Tragic Antagonist. The easiest way to make a villain, quote, complex is at some point to reveal that they're not quite who you thought they were, and that they've got their own tragic backstory which brought them to this point. Resident Evil 7's Jack Baker may seem like a murderous psychopath for most of the game, but it's revealed later that he and most of his family were actually under the control of the bioweapon known as Evelyn and acting against their will. It actually changes the entire perspective of the game. Elsewhere in the Fatal Frame series, antagonists are typically people who are perfectly affable in life and whose spirits have sadly been corrupted in death. Famously, Shadow of the Colossus' titular beasts are only villains in that they stand in your way, despite being largely docile beasts who only attack when provoked. One of the best examples, of course, is the boss in Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, given that players spend the entirety of the game believing her to be a Soviet Union defector, and when they kill her in the final boss battle, it's revealed that she was in fact working for the US the whole time, yet chose to fight to her death in order to bury the hatchet between the two warring nations. Ow. If it feels like a forced play for emotion, the tragic villain reveal can be spectacularly lame. But when it has some semblance of emotional honesty, it adds crucial nuance to the antagonist. I mean, the best villains are the ones who believe they're doing the right thing, after all. Number 2, the Fatal Flaw. Hit the weak points for massive damage. It's an oldie, but a goodie. The enemy weak point has been a common video game cliche to indicate where players should attack an enemy in the pursuit of victory. As much as games don't really owe players an explanation and could very well let them figure everything out on their own, looking at you FromSoft, most games will provide some sort of visual tell to highlight a villain's given weakness. Spoiler alert, if you're playing Zelda, it's the giant eyeball. It's always the giant eyeball. Often these tells actually do exist in universe, so the supposedly unstoppable antagonist is literally walking around the world with targets painted on their body hilariously. Shadow of the Colossus is surely the most evocative example of this, given that each Colossi all have numerous emblem-style weak points for players to attack. It might seem gamey in our more enlightened present, but it's a mechanical cliche that's endured for decades because it works so well. After all, it wouldn't feel like a climactic boss fight if one gunshot to the head did the trick, would it? And number 1, the villain behind the villain. We've all played countless games with a villain bait and switch, where it's revealed that the seemingly primary antagonist actually isn't, with the real big bad hiding in the shadows or emerging from out of nowhere. Extra points if they're the main villain's long-suffering, decidedly smarter underling. Either way, there's no more laugh-out-loud trope than, "They were my puppet the whole time." Mass Effect reveals that antagonist Saren is actually under the mind control of his ship Sovereign, which is in fact a Reaper, while Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped confirms that Dr. Neo Cortex's villainous antics were really commanded by Uka all along. Meanwhile, Kid Icarus Uprising sees the player defeat Medusa, only for her to actually be a mere distraction from the real villain, Hades. Though these rug pulls can certainly flop without the right execution, if they're genuinely surprising and also make some kind of sense, they can force players to view the entire game, perhaps the entire series even, through a distinctly different lens. Maybe it turns the first villain into a tragic one, coming back around to our previous entry, or even a bonus cliche here, an ally for the hero up against a bigger bad. After all, you know what they say, the enemy of my surprising left turn end of game boss fight is my friend? Yeah, that sounds right.